The SS investigated him 6 separate times for crimes so extreme that even Heinrich Himmler's own judges wanted him executed. Not exiled, not demoted, executed. And every single time, the order came down from the top to shut the investigation down and let him keep going. To understand how a man becomes too dangerous, even for the SS, you have to go back to a childhood that gave no warning signs at all. Oskar Dirlewanger was born in 1895 in a middle-class German household in a town that saw nothing unusual about him. There was no poverty that broke him, no abuse that scarred him, no early trauma historians can point to and say, that's where it started. This detail matters more than it seems because it removes the easiest excuse. He wasn't manufactured by circumstance. Whatever happened to him happened on its own. When the First World War broke out, he enlisted almost immediately. On the Western Front, he built a reputation as a genuinely effective soldier. He was wounded multiple times, he kept coming back, and he was awarded the Iron Cross for his conduct in battle. His superiors described him as aggressive in the most useful sense of the word, a man who advanced when others were digging in. But there was something underneath that report that never quite made it onto paper. For Dirlewanger, war didn't feel like a burden he was enduring. It felt like the one place where he moved with total unsettling ease. When the war ended in 1918, most soldiers tried to rebuild ordinary lives. He didn't. Instead, he joined the Freikorps, paramilitary groups made up of former soldiers who kept fighting, this time inside Germany itself, crushing political uprisings with methods that had no place in peacetime. This is the detail that gets skipped over in most retellings, but it's essential. The war hadn't been a phase for him. It had become a default setting. And yet, for a while, there was an attempt at something normal. Dirlewanger enrolled at the University of Frankfurt and, remarkably, completed a doctorate in political science in 1922. Sit with that for a second. This was not an uneducated brute with no other options. He had every opportunity to walk a conventional path, a title, a profession, a respectable life. But outside the structure of a university, everything started to come apart again. He joined the Nazi Party in its earlier years and threw himself into the movement, but his personal conduct became a liability almost immediately, even within a party that was already comfortable with brutality. In 1934, Dirlewanger was arrested and convicted for sexually abusing a 14-year-old girl. This wasn't a rumor or a smear campaign. It was documented, prosecuted, and proven. The consequences were immediate and, on paper, total. Imprisonment, the loss of his academic title, expulsion from the Nazi Party, and removal from any position of authority. By any reasonable measure, that should have been the end of the story. A man with that record does not get a second act. He doesn't get a third one either. But this story isn't about what should have happened. It's about what actually did. After serving part of his sentence, Dirlewanger found the one place that still had use for a man like him, the battlefield. In 1936, he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War alongside German forces supporting Franco. Once again, his value was tied directly to violence, and nothing else. And while he was proving that value overseas, back home, certain men inside the SS were looking at his file from a completely different angle. Arthur Nebe, a senior SS official with close ties to Himmler, saw something specific in Dirlewanger's history. Not a liability, but a resource. Nebe had a practical problem to solve. As the German war machine expanded, it needed units willing to carry out tasks that ordinary soldiers balked at. There was hesitation, there were limits, and limits were exactly what Nebe wanted to remove. His proposal was straightforward: build a unit out of criminals. The logic, twisted as it was, made a kind of sense within that system. Convicted poachers, for instance, already knew how to move through forests and track targets in the wild, skills that translated directly to hunting people instead of animals. And more importantly, these men had nothing left to lose. When Nebe suggested that Dirlewanger command this unit, nobody was operating with incomplete information. His full record, the conviction, the child abuse case, all of it, was on the table. The choice was made anyway, with total awareness of who they were putting in charge. His criminal record was expunged. His academic title was reinstated. His political standing was restored. None of this happened by accident or oversight. It was a deliberate institutional decision. In 1940, the unit was officially formed. Small at first, around 300 men, almost entirely made up of convicts. On paper, it was a specialized anti-partisan force. In practice, the internal structure told a different story. Minimal oversight, vague directives open to interpretation, and, most critically, freedom. That kind of structure would be a disaster under most commanders. For Dirlewanger, it was exactly the environment he needed. He didn't have to push past any boundaries. There simply weren't any there to push past. As the war expanded, so did the unit. New recruits kept arriving, common criminals, prisoners of war, anyone the regime considered expendable. The formation grew larger and more complex, but growth never brought control. It only reinforced a pattern of behavior that was already starting to draw attention, even from within the German military itself. When the unit was deployed to occupied Poland in 1940, the first reports started surfacing. And this is the part that should stop you. These weren't complaints from outside observers. They were coming from German officers, from inside the same system. The reports described looting, executions with no military justification, and violence directed at civilians with no discrimination at all. This wasn't a string of isolated incidents. It was a consistent, repeating pattern, and Dirlewanger's own conduct was named again and again. Officers noted that he showed no concern for discipline or clear strategic objectives. His actions seemed to follow an entirely different logic, one that had nothing to do with winning a war. Formal investigations were opened, witnesses were gathered, evidence was compiled, cases were built through the SS's own internal legal system, and then repeatedly shut down. Orders from above ended the proceedings before any consequence could land. This wasn't a case of missing information, it was a decision. Every time a new accusation surfaced, the same cycle played out. Accusation, investigation, interruption. And that cycle established something unmistakable. Dirlewanger wasn't just being tolerated, he was being protected. And that protection wasn't negligence. It was a calculated functional choice. For men like Himmler, what mattered wasn't how the unit operated. It was what it produced. And inside that logic, Dirlewanger's methods weren't a problem to be managed. They were a solution. This is the turning point that reshapes how you have to understand this entire story. He wasn't a rogue element who slipped past institutional control. He was someone operating with direct, deliberate backing from the top. And that backing was about to be applied on a much larger scale as the war moved east. When Dirlewanger's unit left Poland and was redeployed eastward, the entire context of the war had shifted. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was never just a military campaign. It carried an explicit ideological mission, one where entire territories were treated as disposable and civilian populations were reframed as obstacles to be removed. It was in this environment that Dirlewanger's brigade found even more room to operate without restraint. Belarus became the central stage for this escalation. Officially, operations were labeled anti-partisan, language that implied action against armed resistance, hiding in rural and forested areas. In practice, the word partisan was stretched until it meant almost nothing. A rumor was enough, a neighbor's suspicion was enough. Sometimes plain operational convenience was enough. Here's how it worked, almost every time. Dawn, a village, still asleep. Trucks and men closing in from every road out, so there's nowhere to run before anyone even knows they need to. Families pulled into the street in whatever they were wearing when the doors broke open. Then the sorting. A process that looked procedural, but was really just a countdown to the same outcome. Adult men, first, shot under the excuse that they might fight back. Women, children, the elderly, pushed into a barn or a church or whatever building was large enough to hold them. And then the fire. Anyone who ran from the flames was shot in the open. That was the method. Not once. Not as an aberration. Village after village with only the smallest variations until it stopped being an event and became a routine. One clear enough that German officers themselves wrote it down, in their own words, as standard procedure. And that's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. This wasn't hidden, it was filed. Death counts, place names, dates, typed up with the same flat tone you'd use for a supply report. No outrage in the language, no hesitation, just numbers. In August of 1942, one operation alone left more than 1,000 civilians dead in a single village. The paperwork didn't call it a massacre, it called it a success. Now, step outside the paperwork for a second, because that's where the real story lives. Survivors described children pulled out of cellars days later, blinking into daylight, walking into a village that no longer existed, and realizing, slowly, that they were the only ones left from their entire family. No official report captures that moment. But it happened, over and over across that region, while the men responsible for it were filling out forms in another room. Dirlewanger himself didn't stay back to sign those forms. That's what made him different, even inside a unit built from criminals. Witnesses placed him in the field, close to the killing, not managing it from a distance. And here's the part worth sitting with. The men under his command were not gentle people. Convicted poachers, thieves, violent offenders, men who had already crossed lines most soldiers never would. And even they started asking to be transferred out. Not because of guilt over the war itself, but because what they were watching him do went past whatever line they, personally, still had left. Almost none of those requests were granted. Over the following years, the brigade kept absorbing more men, Soviet prisoners of war, more convicts, anyone the regime decided it could spend without consequence. It grew, but it never tightened. It only got more efficient at what it already was. Historians place the death toll in Belarus alone in the tens of thousands, and even that number carries an asterisk, because in some villages, there was no one left standing to be counted. And through all of it, the pattern never broke. Reports kept landing on someone's desk, complaints kept surfacing from inside the German military itself, and still nothing stopped. That silence wasn't an accident, it was a decision, made and remade every time a new report came in and went nowhere. And here's a question worth sitting with before we get to what happened in Warsaw. When dozens of soldiers inside a criminal unit, men who had already committed serious crimes themselves, are the ones asking to be transferred away from their own commander? What does that actually tell you about where the real moral floor was in that system? Type your answer in the comments, because I think it says more about the SS than it does about Dirlewanger himself. As the war progressed, the Eastern Front became increasingly unstable, and German forces faced mounting pressure on nearly every side. That shifting context by 1944 pushed Dirlewanger's brigade toward an entirely new environment, a major European capital where the dynamics of combat would look nothing like the rural operations that came before. Warsaw became that new stage. In August of 1944, the city became the center of an uprising organized by the Polish resistance, aiming to retake control before Soviet forces arrived. The German response was immediate and extreme, and Dirlewanger's brigade was sent in to help crush it. Unlike previous operations, this violence now unfolded in an urban environment, in broad daylight in a European capital. That didn't reduce the intensity of what followed. It amplified its visibility and its impact. Upon entering Warsaw, specifically the Wola district, the unit received explicit orders: eliminate the civilian population. What followed was a sequence of mass executions carried out with brutal efficiency. Residents were pulled from buildings, grouped in streets or courtyards, and killed with machine gun fire. Hospitals were stormed, and patients too injured to move were executed in their beds. Medical staff who tried to intervene met the same fate. The speed of these actions was one of the most striking aspects of the entire massacre. Within just a few days, tens of thousands of people were killed in a relatively small area of the city. The pace left no room for any distinction between combatants and civilians. Simply being present was enough to determine someone's fate. Even within the brigade, this triggered pushback. Some members, already accustomed to previous operations, considered the level of violence excessive. And still, the chain of command held, and the orders kept being carried out. The destruction wasn't limited to people either. After the initial executions, a systematic demolition process began. Buildings were burned or blown apart, turning entire sections of the city into rubble. The objective stopped being about controlling the city and became about erasing it as a livable space altogether. By the end of the uprising, months later, Warsaw was largely destroyed, and a massive number of civilians had been killed. Within this context, Dirlewanger's role became one of the most heavily documented chapters of his entire career. And once again, the system's response wasn't punishment, it was recognition. After the destruction of Warsaw, Dirlewanger's standing within the Nazi structure wasn't weakened. It was reinforced. In September of 1944, while the city still lay in ruins and the death toll was still being tallied, he received one of the highest German military honors available. The decision came directly from the top levels of the regime. There was no ambiguity in that message. What had been done wasn't just accepted. It was valued. That recognition helps explain a central thread running through Dirlewanger's entire trajectory. At no point was he treated as a problem that needed solving. Records show that at least 6 formal investigations were opened against him over the course of the war. In every single one, there was enough evidence to justify severe punishment, even by the standards of the SS itself. Officer testimonies, written reports, administrative documentation. The material was consistent, thorough, and damning. And every single time, the case was shut down before it went anywhere. One of the names most associated with these attempts was an SS judge tasked with investigating crimes within the organization itself. He wasn't motivated by ideological opposition to the regime. He was concerned with internal discipline. To him, Dirlewanger's conduct represented a structural risk, something that undermined the functioning of the system as a whole. And still, his investigations were systematically blocked. Orders from above shut the process down before it reached any real conclusion. There was no internal debate about it. The decision came from higher up, and it was final. That pattern repeated itself throughout the war, even after incidents that generated significant internal concern. The explanation for that constant protection doesn't come down to personal favoritism or administrative carelessness. It comes down to perceived usefulness. For the leadership of the SS, Dirlewanger served a very specific function, carrying out operations that required a total absence of restraint. While other commanders still operated within certain limits, however minimal, Dirlewanger's brigade functioned in a space where those limits simply didn't exist. And within the logic of the regime, that was considered necessary. Meanwhile, the war itself was collapsing rapidly for Germany. By early 1945, the Eastern Front was falling apart. Allied advances were closing in from multiple directions, and units like Dirlewanger's brigade began fragmenting under the pressure. In February of that year, he was wounded in combat. The severity of the injury pulled him temporarily off the front line, and it also coincided with the moment the entire structure that had protected him for years began to disintegrate. Without the same chain of command, without the same institutional cover, his position became unstable for the first time in nearly a decade. As enemy forces advanced, Dirlewanger moved west, trying to avoid capture. During this period, he abandoned his official identity and attempted to blend in with the flow of soldiers and civilians fleeing the collapsing front. That attempt didn't last long. In late May of 1945, after the war in Europe had already ended, he was captured by French forces. Initially, he wasn't recognized as a high-ranking figure. Without a uniform and using a false name, he was processed as an ordinary prisoner and transferred to a detention facility in southern Germany, a simple installation never built to handle a man of his significance within the Nazi system, just one of many overwhelmed sites absorbing prisoners in the chaos of the immediate post-war period. Among the guards were soldiers of different nationalities, including Polish guards, and that detail matters enormously. For years, Dirlewanger's brigade had operated across Polish territory, carrying out actions that resulted in the deaths of an enormous number of civilians. The presence of guards from that background created a very specific situation inside that prison. On the night of June 5, 1945, Dirlewanger was pulled from his cell and beaten to death. There was no trial, no formal interrogation, no detailed record made of what happened, at least not in the moment. His death was fast, direct, and entirely outside any legal process. How you interpret that moment still sparks debate today. For some, it represents a form of immediate justice delivered by people directly affected by the actions of units like his. For others, it raises a different, harder question. The absence of a trial also meant the loss of testimony that could have filled in the full picture of what happened. Testimony about the chain of command, about who else made the decisions that let his brigade operate the way it did for years. A formal process would have produced statements, cross-examinations, documented accounts of the command structure and the choices made throughout the war. Without that, a piece of this history was never recorded directly by the one man who could have spoken to all of it. Other figures involved in creating and sustaining the brigade went through trials afterward. Some were convicted, but served only a fraction of their sentences. That gap between Dirlewanger's fate and theirs shows just how uneven the post-war reckoning actually was. His absence from those proceedings left real gaps. Historians have had to rely on the documents that survived, wartime reports and survivor testimony to reconstruct what the brigade actually did. And even now, estimates of the total number of victims vary significantly, not because the evidence is thin, but because the scale of the operations makes a precise count almost impossible. But regardless of the exact numbers, the pattern is unmistakable. Dirlewanger operated for years with full institutional knowledge and backing. He was investigated repeatedly, and every single time he was protected. He was promoted and decorated, while his actions were being logged internally in cold administrative language. His path wasn't cut short by a failure of the system. It was sustained by it, deliberately, from start to finish. If this kind of history matters to you, the parts that get buried under bureaucratic language, the moments where institutions chose complicity over accountability, subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week. Drop a like if you made it this far, and let me know in the comments what you think really deserves more attention. The man himself, or the system that kept protecting him. I'll see you in the next one.